Welcome back to chapter 8. This is the second video on joints. Last time we briefly talked about or introduced the 6 types of synovial joints. Synovial joints, which are the most abundant joints in the human body, are classified by their shape and the way they can move because of their shape. You have 6 different types of synovial joints. You have your ball and socket joint, your condylar joint. So where's the bone? So bone and socket joint. You have your condylar joint. You have your plane joint. You have the hinge joints. You have the pivot joints. And you have the saddle joints. Again, here's a video explaining the different types of joints in a little bit more detail or a little bit differently from what I'm explaining it. So if you need more explanation, there is a resource for you. All right. So specifically the different types of synovial joints. As mentioned, you have your ball and socket joints. These are also called spheroidal joints. Spheroidal joints. So a sphere is a ball. All right. So that should be able to help you remember that there is a ball as a part of a ball and socket joint. Your hip joints, your shoulder joints are these types of ball and socket joints. So basically, what you have is you have this sphere, you have this ball that goes into a cup that is just big enough for this ball to sit in. And that arrangement allows for the widest range of motion. So that ROM means range of motion in that joint. Because it is a ball, you can take that joint and move it in any plane, any direction that you want. This is what allows your legs to swing freely, your arms to swing freely in the joint. So this is your hip joint, your femur connecting to your hip bone in a ball and socket joint. And you also have a very similar setup in your shoulder joint that connects your humerus to your scapula. You have the condyloid joint. These are also called ellipsoid joints. So a condyloid joint is an oval condyle that fits into this elliptical cavity. This is the type of joint that you have between your metacarpals and your phalanges. So the metacarpals are your hand bones. When you look at your hand, you see your fingers. Your fingers go from the tip to the proximal end. Your proximal end is what connects to your metacarpals. So when we look at our hands, we don't see the metacarpal bones, which look like, if you're looking at the skeleton, it looks like an extension of your fingers. But so when you touch it, you can actually feel your metacarpals. But because of the skin that covers over it, it just looks like a big solid structure right here. But that is where your condyloid joints are going to occur between your metacarpals and your phalanges. Phalanges are the fingers. This allows for the back and forth movement. So the way you can open and close your fingers or flex and extend your fingers and go side to side is because of this condyloid joint. You have gliding joints. So these are also called plane joints. These joints are almost flat or have a very slight curve. These are the joints that occur between your carpals, which are your wrist bones, or your tarsals, which are your ankle bones. So what allows all of these carpal bones to function and move together in concert are these almost flat or slightly curved joints called your gliding joints. They allowed for the sliding of the bones with one another or the back and forth or twisting motion of the bones. These are non-axial movements. Then you have your hinge joints. It looks like what we know of a hinge to be. So if you think about a hinge on a door, you have a convex surface that fits into a concave surface. So this is an example of what your hinge joints look like. So you have this convex surface from one joint or one bone that fits into this concave surface of another bone. Your elbow is an example of this hinge joint. Also between your phalanges, so between the joints of the actual finger, you have these hinge joints. These joints allow movement in one plane, so it's uniaxial because you can only move in that one plane. You can only flex and extend your joint in that your elbow joint in that one direction. You have your pivot joints. These are also called trochoid joints. These occur at the proximal ends of the radius and ulna, so your lower arm bones. They also occur between your atlas and the dens of your axis. So between C1 and C2, you have a pivot joint that allows the rotation of those bones around a central axis. All right. So the reason why you can turn your head the way you do, in part, is because this atlas, this C1, the first cervical vertebrae, sits on the axis that has a dens, C2, that these two sit on top of one another so that this can rotate your head. All right, so that is a pivot joint. Then you have a saddle joint that's also called your sellar joint. In a saddle joint, both ends, or both, it, let me take that over. Your saddle joint, both joints have a convex and a concave surface. So if you look between your carpal, so the wrist bone, and the metacarpal, the the bone in your hand that connects your joint to your thumb to your wrist, you'll notice that it has both this outward projection and that inward projection. So that is the concave and the convex surfaces on the ends of both bones, saddle joint. So here is a classification, a summary of the different types of joints that we have. So you have, these are the structural classifications. You have your fibrous joints, your cartilaginous joints, and your synovial joints. And this is a little bit more. So here you have your bound by collagen fibers, bound by cartilage, and these have these synovial capsules. These are the different types of each joints, and this is the different types of mobility that each has. So your functional classifications. So let's talk about the different types of joint movements. Because your skeletal muscles are connected to bones across a joint, when your skeletal muscles contract, that is what allows movement of the bones and ultimately movement of your body. When you're talking about muscle and how it moves, one end of that muscle is called the origin. The other end is called the insertion. Now, I'm not expecting you all to know the origins and insertions of each muscle, but do understand that depending on the field that you're going in and the area of the field that you're going in, you may actually have to go back and learn the origins and insertions of each muscle. I will also tell you that it may help to learn the origins and insertions so that you can know the joint, the movement of each of those muscles. The origin is relatively fixed. So this is the end of the muscle that is not moving at all. The insertion is the more movable end. So this is the end that actually produces the movement in the joint or at the bone level. All right, so you have your origin that's relatively fixed. You have your insertion that is more movable, and this is the one that actually allows the movement of the bones at the joint. Movement at a joint occurs when a skeletal muscle contracts and the fibers pull the insertion toward the origin. So remember, this is the movable end. This is the relatively fixed end. When a muscle contracts, this end is moved closer to that end, and that is what produces body movement. So some of the movements of joints are called flexion. This is when you bend your joints, so you make that the angle of the joint smaller. Extension is when you straighten that body part. So if you talk about your hip joint, when you bend forward, or when you're greeting a queen or a king and you bend forward, or bow, I should say, that is flexion. When you stand back up or straighten that joint, that is extension. Hyperextension is when you go beyond normal anatomical position. Remember that anatomical position is when a person is standing straight up, head forward, eyes straight ahead, feet about hip width hip width apart, toes facing forward, arms at the side, palms facing forward. So in that position, when you're standing erect, your all of your joints, or most of your joints, are in extension, because this is where your joints are straightened. Anything beyond that extension is considered hyperextension. That's anything that's beyond that normal anatomical position. So when you see people standing up and their legs, their knee joints go backwards, that is hyperextension. Or when you lean back, so instead of flexing at the hip joint, you lean back, that is a type of hyperextension. Lateral flexion is when you are decreasing the angle at a joint, but you're doing it toward the side. So bending from one side to another is lateral flexion. So if you bend your head toward your shoulder, that is lateral flexion, either on the right or the left. If you bend your body at your hip, either toward the right or toward the left, that is lateral extension, lateral flexion of your hip. Now, abduction and adduction. When you go to the gym and you see the people sitting in that machine where they're either pushing their knees out against a weight, or pushing their knees toward each other against a weight, that is abduction and adduction. Abduction, this one, is when you move a body part away from the midline. Adduction is when you move the body part toward the midline. So, excuse me, if you're putting your knees together, if you're squeezing the machine to pull your knees together, that is adduction. You're adding your knees back toward the midline. And if you have the machine on the outside of your knees and you're pushing against that resistance, that is abduction. So again, lateral flexion is when you are bending, you're decreasing that angle at the joint, but you're doing it toward the side. That is lateral flexion. Here, this is a hip joint. We're looking at the hip joint movement. Bending that leg up is decreasing that angle. That's flexion. Bringing it back down is extension. At the knee joint, flexion occurs when the lower leg goes back, whereas extension is when you straighten your lower leg. And then abduction is when you take this leg and you pull it away from the other leg, or away from the midline. That is abduction. When you bring it back to where it originally was, that's adduction, adduction. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion are the only types of flexion in the body where both opposite movements are considered a flexion. This occurs in the feet, or at the ankle. If your ankle or when your ankle points up toward your face, or when you're walking on your heels so that your toes are pointing up, that is dorsiflexion. When you are walking on your toes, or when you're pressing the gas pedal, or when you're pointing your toes downward, that is plantar flexion. So, pointing your toes or pressing the gas pedal is plantar flexion. Walking on your heels or bringing your toes toward your head is dorsiflexion. Circumduction. Circumduction is when you move a body part in a circular path. So when you were in gym in grade school and your PE teacher told you to swing your arms in a big, huge circle, that is circumduction, which is different from rotation. Rotation is when you move a body part around an axis. So let me show you a picture of what that looks like. Circumduction is this big circle. So big arm circles, circumduction. Rotation is when you just move the arm. So this joint is not moving in this big circle. It is literally rotating in and out along its axis. That is rotation. So medial rotation is when the movement of the limb is moved in such a way that the anterior surface is moving toward the midline. Whereas lateral rotation is when your anterior surface moves away from the midline. There's still types of rotation, but one is moving inward toward the midline, one is moving outward away from the midline. Then you have your supination and your pronation. Supination refers to the position of the palms when your hands or the palms of your hands are facing up or forward the way they are in anatomic position. That is supination. When your palms are facing downward or backwards, that is pronation. So supination, palms facing up, pronation, palms facing down. You have inversion and eversion. Inversion and eversion refer to the foot movements. So if the bottom of your feet faces toward the midline, your bottom of your foot faces toward the midline, that is inversion. Or you're walking on the outside of your feet, that is inversion of the foot. Eversion of the foot is when your plantar surface or the bottom surface of your foot is pointing away from the midline. So if you were walking as though you were knock-kneed, your the plantar surface or the bottom of the feet would be facing laterally or facing outwardly. That is eversion. And to show you a picture, this where the plantar surface or the bottom surface of the foot is facing the midline is inversion. When it's facing outward or more laterally, this is eversion. Protraction and retraction is when the body part moves forward. Protraction is when the body part moves forward. Retraction is when the body part moves backward. Specifically, we're talking about the head in this particular example. So when your chin juts forward, that is protraction. Protraction. When your chin goes back to normal, that is retraction. Elevation and depression. Elevation is when you raise a body part or elevate that body part. Depression is when you lower that body part. So if you look at the shoulders, when you shrug your shoulders up, that's elevation. When you drop your shoulders down, that's depression. And those are your joint movements.